to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and today we'll be discussing the root issue of why we tend to approach Bach performance on the piano from a default position of playing with a strict rhythmic pulse. In other episodes, I've talked about the use of ritardando and rubato in Bach, when it is appropriate, and how to employ them. But in truth, the majority of Bach's keyboard works are not suited for extreme or frequent tempo fluctuations of any sort, and conveniently, our performance tradition on the modern instrument follows this tact. One could consider this a chicken and egg paradox. Does the music encourage a kind of strict rhythmic pulse, or did the performance tradition evolve to this end separately, of its own accord? In this episode, I'm going to discuss this problem and offer reasons why I think we perform Bach the way we do on the modern piano. The question on this episode of Ask a Pianist is, why do we play Bach metronomically? The first part of the problem is contained in the pieces themselves. Let's use a rather typical piece of Bach as a demonstration point. Bach's music is frequently described as horizontally driven, that the most important aspects for us to interpret and communicate to an audience are based in flowing continuum rather than as separate musical events. There is some evidence to support this. Bach, for instance, has clear rhythmic and harmonic statements, which divide the piece into different sections, and the division is marked by a long cadence. Our first section ends with a long 5-1 here. This happens very often, in fact. After long cadences, we can also find shifts in gesture, which signify a change in either character or expressive content. Like here, where the opening march changes to a flowing river of sound. Seeing here is a piece that is divided harmonically and gesturally into large sections, with the material inside each section being homogeneous in nature. Another piece of evidence which suggests horizontal expression can be found in the texture and the gestures themselves. The highly contrapuntal nature of the piece means that voices overlap in terms of beginning and ending, so that you get music that flows over the bar line or pulse. If we play the right hand voices slowly, you'll hear the gestures which are similar and yet staggered, so that when one ends, another begins. Even in the chordal march sections, we still have pickups which drive the movement forward and almost prevent us from focusing on an individual beat or bar. Our ears are drawn to the possibility of what the material is leading to, as opposed to what the material is saying now. With this kind of horizontal emphasis, we find ourselves making auditory connections between the harmonic cadences and sections. To take time or use rubato heavily would actually sabotage the ability for us to hear these kinds of connections. This is why, for the most part, we take time in Bach only at important cadences that delineate the structure. In a similar way, we don't take time to explore individual gestures in Bach because the gestures usually repeat themselves frequently, if not in the same voice, then in others. To take time to make a single gesture interesting or special would create structural confusion when the other gestures appear in sequence. Why is one gesture more special than another? Lastly, Bach doesn't ask for tempo variance of any kind in a single movement. He usually sets a regular rhythmic pattern and pulse and maintains it through consistent time signatures and stable divisions of that time. We're not starting in 4/4 to change to 3/4 2 bars on, or having triplets in the right hand over duplets in the left, like in Brahms, for example. Everything is ordered to create a continuum of sound, rather than individual special moments of sound. We could say that the music asks for non-interference when it comes to rhythm or pulse, that any change would risk subverting the effectiveness of the structure or counterpoint. But there's much more to it than that. Let's try playing it as if I did not have control over dynamics or sound production. We'll get to why I'm doing this in a moment. When Bach was writing music, there were 3 keyboard instruments which were in common usage at the time: the organ, harpsichord, and clavichord. The clavichord was the only instrument upon which one could vary dynamics, pitch, and sound control directly from the key. The other 2 could only shift these elements through the use of stops. On all of them, however, the vector of interpretation that had the most communicative power was in fact tempo fluctuation, with articulation included in this. When playing on the organ, one has no choice but to emphasize articulation and rubato to express important elements in the music because the sound palette is uniform. Similarly, but much more problematically on the harpsichord, because the sound palette decays very fast, whereas on the organ the sound essentially continues forever. The clavichord provided the only keyboard possibility wherein a performer could make the kinds of dynamic and sound quality shifts that we can on the modern piano. However, it is so soft as to render many of these shifts discernible only to those sitting right next to it. In all of these cases, the most expressive power a keyboardist had was the variation and flux of tempo and rhythmic pulse. So, let's consider this piece again as I played it just now, without dynamic or sound change. If I was restricted and could only express elements through fluctuating the tempo or pulse, what could I do to make this piece more interesting? Well, I'll play it as if I was in fact playing it on a harpsichord. There's quite a lot of subtle rubato, and a lot of subtle ritardando, and the tempo is not held too steady for too long, lest things stop being interesting to the ear. What this means is that when a vector of expression and interpretation is restricted or not available, other ones must be used in excess in order to communicate the same amount of information. If I want to make a cadence sound impressive or important, but I cannot have a crescendo or change in dynamic level leading up to it, then I must take time as I approach it instead. Similarly, if I want a note to sound important as a singular entity, or in other words, if I want to accent it, but I don't have the ability to play it louder than the other notes, then I have no choice but to alter my articulation so that there's a silence before the accented note, thus making the accent seem like one of volume. On historical instruments, this all works quite well because there isn't much of an overload. We're saying something without overemphasizing it. But when we transfer the music to the modern piano, we run across a few problems with this. To be clear, any music written prior to 1860 is essentially written for a different instrument than the one we have now. In other words, to play older music on the modern piano is to create a transcription, and as a result, we are forced into making concessions to take into account the fact that this music was written for the capabilities and weaknesses of a different instrument. Bach's music is special in this regard, however, because for the most part it is constructed without a specific instrument in mind. His works can be freely transcribed to other instruments without any problems. But this is due to his compositional aesthetic and language, which emphasizes abstract counterpoint rather than instrument-specified sound effects. The modern piano gains with this kind of music, no doubt. We can do just about anything on it. But this can be a problem if we find we can do so much that the material ends up being covered by expressive effects. Let's try playing this piece again, using all that is available to us. Tempo fluctuation, like on historical instruments, and dynamic and sound quality fluctuation that is available to us on the modern piano. On the surface level, this interpretation would be referred to as a romantic or romanticized interpretation of Bach, and for a time this was a common way that this music was performed. As always, on a first listen, one can't positively identify anything that is necessarily incorrect about it, but at the same time, it seems like there's too much emphasis made about things which don't seem to either require or deserve it. Let's look a little closer. First, let's look at the cadences. If we play them from the perspective of being on an instrument with no dynamic capabilities, then we're forced to approach the cadences using time to emphasize them. If we play the cadences with dynamic emphasis rather than time, then we could still make the cadence important, but just on a different vector. A little crescendo goes a long way. In either case, the structural purpose of the cadence remains clear. On an instrument with no dynamic capability, structure will be easily perceived because the ear will not be distracted by small variations in sound quality or dynamic. And when the same piece is placed on an instrument that has dynamic capabilities but is played using a steady pulse, once again structure will come through, this time because the steady rhythm frames the structure in a very clear way. But if we mix the dynamic capabilities with rhythmic stretching, we end up with enough auditory distractions that draw attention away from the structural purpose of the cadence and instead make the cadence into a special event or effect, almost divorcing it from the rest of the piece. Sometimes it's helpful to consider extreme versions of musical performance in order to determine for oneself what constitutes too much in an interpretation. Though the actual amount is purely subjective, all pianists definitely have personal boundaries regarding too much or too little of anything, whether it be tempo fluctuation, dynamic shift, or any other vector of communication. This, of course, directly relates to the shady and undefined concept that is stylistic taste. Tastes differ depending on the individual, and this makes much of my previous discussion rather problematic because it assumes a specific taste judgment based on perceived elements of compositional writing. Some may like Bach performed with lots of expressive elements. Some may like Bach performed strictly and with little expression at all. Some may like it with a heavy sound, some with a light sound. This is not what I'm trying to argue. My argument about using expressive vectors goes beyond personal opinion, because what I'm looking at is the purpose and result of using specific vectors in order to express or communicate something in this specified musical aesthetic. In the same way that a Chopin Polonaise cannot function if the rhythm is not played with a Polonaise swing, Bach cannot function if the structure is torn to shreds. It's not about how something is played, it's about why we choose to play something the way we do. Though I have personal ideas about why one vector may be more effective than another, I will gladly consider another interpretation as long as it's thought out. There must be reasons why we do something. An interesting problem arises in the piece when we reach the areas of continuous motion. Here, we're stuck with certain vectors that are definitely effective and others which seem out of place entirely. Let's play this with a strict rhythm, with some dynamics to give the impression of shape to the line. If we were to add tempo flux to this, then we'd run into problems. First, if we swing the rhythm slightly, it will throw off the imitation of gestures, which is happening in the different voices. take it to the logical extreme and try playing in a way that each gesture imitates and expands on the other. If one gesture takes time, the imitation of it takes more. This doesn't work at all. For the imitation to communicate clearly to the audience, we almost have no choice due to the texture, but to play it strictly or close to in time. This doesn't even take into account a very big problem with the sound on the piano. The piano sound is thick and voluptuous compared with the harpsichord or clavichord, and counterpoint can easily be lost if we're not careful. If we played with too much damper pedal, this problem becomes immediately evident. This doesn't automatically mean that we must play the piece trying to imitate the sound of a harpsichord, for instance, though that can be an interesting direction to take sonically. What we have to do is go beyond that level and think more along the lines of what can we do to make the texture, harmony, gesture, and structure communicate most clearly and efficiently to the audience. If a section is running like this one and is complex in terms of texture and gesture, then we must approach it from a transparent point of view first. Then, we can add other vectors of expression into it as long as these do not get in the way of the transparency. This is why we could add tempo flux, but not dynamics, like on a harpsichord, and also why we could add dynamic contrast, but not tempo flux, on the piano. But to do both clouds the musical transmission. So, what is the answer? We play Bach on the piano metronomically, because it affords us the opportunity to use vectors of expression, like dynamic contrast and sound quality change, which are extremely important and effective vectors on the piano. If we add tempo flux to this mix in this aesthetic, we get an overload of expressive change which hides or dismantles the structure and texture of the music. Pretty simple. This also applies to our discussion about toccatas and extreme rubato. The areas where rubato occurs are also areas of extreme openness in texture and extreme structural fluidity. Essentially, the reasons that forbade the use of tempo flux no longer exist in the toccata world. As to the chicken and egg paradox, the answer I have is this. Given that Bach chooses to follow an aesthetic of counterpoint and harmonic clarity first and foremost, and that his pieces were transcribed by him freely for other instrument and voice combinations, I'd say that his pieces, in a sense, came first, and that he wasn't necessarily writing pieces specifically to showcase the limitations of the instruments he had at hand. Our performance practice comes from experience of what seems to communicate best, and on the piano, Bach seems to work best when the pulse and tempo is consistent and steady. So, that's why we play it metronomically. Until next time, keep on practicing, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.